Welcome to Another Cup, part of the Exchange Coffee Podcasting Network presented by Kavoya Specialty Coffee, where coffee is always a collaborative voyage. Another Cup is devoted to conversations with suppliers, customers, and all the relationships in between. For episode 16, Mark Inman, Dave Griswold, and me, Mike Ferguson, sat down at the recent SCA Expo in Houston to talk about, well, a few different things, from how Dave started in coffee to next-level sustainability and the Cup of Excellence. Dave begins by giving us his first impressions of Mark Inman when they met all those years ago.
That's what I found Mark. I found him a little bit, I was repulsed initially. I mean, we spoke off the air about that.
Who wouldn't be? Yeah. The story I heard is that...
All right.
The story that I heard is Inman just kept coming into the office every day. And you're like, dude, you don't work here. I'm not paying you. But he just kept coming into the office.
Yeah.
And finally you just...
And I said, why do I have an office? And they said, that's a milk crate, sir.
The thing was, he came in and he gave me this big presentation, big chart about why he was the right person and how much his sales would increase,
That's
that was
not
me.
true. That was you. So the real story behind that is back in 1999, actually, when we were planning SCA San Francisco.
Yeah.
I used to buy coffee from Dave as a customer,
right.
And every time I would come to see Dave to talk about the conference and the prep, he would have this chart with like this, arc going upwards, and it was the tailor-made sales through sustainable harvest.
we were projecting a lot of increase in sales based on my personality and Mark's empathy for a guy who was a one-person office. I mean, I think Mark would come in there and think, I hope this guy doesn't shoot himself. He's so lonely.
But I did come close to that number. I was buying increasingly more coffee every year from Dave. So Dave Griswold is the founder of Sustainable Harvest, the famous Sustainable Harvest coffee company, importers. Started as Aztec Harvest.
Oh, yeah.
That was
we used to have an Aztec bag on the wall at Batrop and Brunson.
Dave would...
Right, or maybe it was the poster, remember? Was it a poster with the Quetzal bird with the bean in the beak?
Maybe, but wasn't there a bag with the mark on it?
Yeah, the bag had that mark on it as well.
Yeah.
I just hope you got some of the collateral materials. I spent a lot of money back in the day.
I was a customer of Dave's for many, many years, of both Aztec Harvest and Sustainable Harvest. So when I sold out and went into import and trading, I still stayed in the periphery of Dave. We remained friends. And then I had the absolute pleasure of working for Dave at Sustainable Harvest for a handful of years, and was a part of that team, which was an awesome experience. And Dave, I always consider I got to work with my best friend, and that was a great highlight of my coffee career.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, folks.
And that's a wrap. That's a pretty interesting guy.
So, Dave, if there are people out there that don't know who you are, tell us a bit about your background, how you got here, and what you're up to today.
I always felt it was kind of an interesting story because I think so many of us often look back on our careers and we think, what was that question that somebody asked us that made us decide, I'm going to do that?
Right.
And so when I was back in my youth and I decided to go down and volunteer with coffee farmers in Mexico. And this was at the time that the International Coffee Agreement was being dismantled. So this does date me a little
89.
bit. 89, right. The Berlin Wall had fallen.
Right.
And
were you a part of that effort?
Well, I didn't realize that would affect coffee prices, right? That the no longer having a Soviet-U.S. rift would mean that they would take away the ICA quotas, right? The International Coffee Agreement.
Were you living in Spain at the time?
I was in D.C. working for a nonprofit at the time, and one of the fellows that we funded through Ashoka, was the name of the nonprofit that funded social entrepreneurs, was working in coffee. And so my wife, who I met actually at that nonprofit, Marie, and I went down to Mexico and we volunteered. I went into coffee. So what happened, Mark, was I was down in Mexico City and just working as a volunteer, planning to go to business school. And I was interested in coffee because it was kind of close to the beach, right? The mountains are always nestled up I was in the Acapulco area. But I went to Mexico City one day, and I was at the office where there were a handful of volunteers working, Mexican leaders that were trying to organize themselves when the coffee market was in a price free fall and the government had liberalized the Coffee Institute. So there was no more marketing. There was no more technical assistance. It was just farmers, and there were 250,000 at the time, were left to themselves. And a farmer went 7 hours on a bus with a bag of beans and parchment from Nayarit, that's near Puerto Vallarta, back then, and he represented 300 families. And he came all the way to the office, and he came into the office, and he sat down, and he said, "I heard you're here to help us sell our beans." And I looked, and I thought, oh my gosh, I don't even know the first thing. There was no internet at the time. And I'd been reading the first ITC guide, the coffee guide, that now is in its 4th or 5th edition. And he showed me the beans in parchment. And the one thing I knew is you couldn't send those beans like that with parchment on them to a broker in California or New York.
Right.
And I realized he didn't taste his coffee. He didn't know the world he was selling into. And yet all of these families depended on this for their income. And so when he asked me, "Will you help us?" I thought, well, how do these farmers sell this stuff? And I decided to go up to New York, and I went to a phone booth back in the day and a phone book, and I looked up coffee buyers, and I went to Wall Street, and I had a carousel projector with slides and a bag of roasted coffee, and I went into one of the biggest commodity firms, and all these guys in white shirts and black ties that had these TVs that had these funny screens on them, and I didn't realize that was the C market. So I was pretty wet behind the ears, the wide-eyed intern.
You were in the belly of the beast.
Yeah. And trying to tell them about taste of place and farmers and stories, and they said, "Listen, kid, we don't buy coffee that way. We buy it on spec. It's called prime washed." And I said, "Well, okay." And then they said, "Well, how many farmers do you represent?" And I was like one of those officious, wide-eyed interns. And I said, "We represent 250,000 farmers." And they said, "Great. Why don't you put all those containers in Laredo on Thursday and we'll buy them?" And I realized for the first time, like, okay, you don't get yourself organized first before you go into the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
But at that point, I was a little embarrassed, and they sort of laughed as I left the office. But I knew there were these two guys up in Vermont who made ice cream that cared about where products came up. So I went up to Ben & Jerry's office, and I took the same story. And they didn't say yes, but they didn't say no.
Right.
They just said, "Why don't you go down the street and talk to this company, Bob Stiller and Dan Cox, Green Mountain Coffee. It's a 5-store chain." And so those were my first 2 customers out there. And what I think the point of that story is not like how do you meet Ben & Jerry's, but that every time that you're an entrepreneur trying to start something, hopefully along the way there's somebody who sort of lends a hand or gives you a step up, rather than just telling you, like, making fun of you and then walking you walk out the door.
Right.
Yeah, but also just saying next instead of just calling it quits after must have been an overwhelming experience on Wall Street.
Yeah. I felt pretty down.
You could have just called it a day, but you were like, okay, next. What's next? What can I do next?
Yeah, and I want to say something to that, Mike. It's probably one of the reasons that I did sort of say next is that I was so committed to sustainable coffee being a thing. And at that time, not only did I have to define what does sustainability mean, because this is in the early 90s and it's not a term yet, but most people said, no, that's not what people care about. And I was so convinced and stubborn that I almost wanted, I wouldn't quit even when I was told no, because I wanted to prove. And that can be both good and bad on your health when you're when you're so stuck. But
amazingly, people still say that's not as important to people as and I just don't know how you can make that statement this day and age.
It seems like this generation now, our children do seem to care a lot about where products come from,
right,
and how they're grown,
right. But you talk to a lot of buyers here, and it's not on. It's like they'll act like it's not important, and it's like it is actually in the consumer mind. It's extremely important.
Yeah, I don't know how do we. Is it because that they feel like it's always an extra and it's an extra cost and there's not a business case?
And there's extra work. It's an extra hassle. There's more steps. And like the guys on Wall Street, the cleaner, easier way is the right way in their mind.
Yeah, it's true. And so Mike, what happened after that fateful meeting with Ben & Jerry's is I spent the next 25 years trying to build a company. Started with Mexico, like Aztec Harvest, and then decided to do sustainable, and Mark became a client. And I was lucky to be in specialty coffee when everybody was just getting started.
Yeah.
And I got involved with the association a lot, and that was really helpful because I was a one-person office. And for all those entrepreneurs out there that are kind of like working alone, I remember what that was like. And being part of an association allowed me to have more colleagues And then when I became president, at one point, I actually had even people who would do some of the work.
Yeah. I remember that's when we met in 98.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was fun. It was fun work, and it's been fun to build. And you look at this place now, this World of Coffee, Specialty Coffee Association. It's kind of it just brings a smile to my face.
Oh, absolutely. Now did you go to the show last year?
No, I sold my company a couple years ago, so I took a little time off to kind of figure out what do I do next.
Right. What do you do when you for the next phase in life? And have you figured that out? Have you landed at that place?
I've been turned on by to this concept of, well, how are we going to do something about the climate? How are we going to take the carbon, the 10 gigatons of carbon that we need to take out of the air? And I've been working with a firm in San Francisco and a few others now who are trying to develop programs that could involve coffee farmers, coffee cherry, and a concept called biochar, which is basically, in a sense, burning at super high temperatures without oxygen bio waste like coffee cherry or cacao pods into something that then you can put in the soil, and it stops the carbon cycle, so it can be eligible for durable carbon credits. So that means money for farmers, and it's incredibly useful for the soil. And I know, Mark, you being somebody who lives in an area where there's so much growing, and your background with regenerative,
right?
The kind of things that biochar does when mixed with fertilizer increases yields, 20 to 30%.
Yeah, quite a bit. Yeah.
So that's what I'm working on. It allows me to stay connected with farmers and buyers as well.
Excellent. And would you be doing this type of work with existing old suppliers you had relationships with prior, or would this be a whole new world for you?
Well, I think we want to bring it to the coffee industry. As I look in your eyes and I talk about biochar, most people are like, I haven't heard about this. I think that's my role, is now to sort of figure out how do we tell people what's the business case for this. How big is the market? What's the addressable market? How would farmers get involved, both big, medium, and small? I mean, some of the big companies, I think Olam has got some biochar stuff going on. I'm always concerned about like the smallholder co-ops. How do they sort of have a seat at the table? Right. And I think it's a super interesting and just ready to begin being a real thing. And I want to be on the front edge of that and share it transparently.
And what have been some of the highlights of the show for you coming back here this weekend?
Seeing my friends here at Kavoya, which was, I think because I haven't been back for a couple of years, it's incredible how relational coffee is. And I talked to a guy who worked for Google who's now getting in the coffee business. He's like, this show is amazing. I've never seen, this kind of, connectivity between people. And I was thinking, why is that? And I feel like a little bit of it is you have literally thousands of small entrepreneurs here, right? It's a very different kind of person who starts businesses. All these farmers, whether they're co-op leaders or their own finca, they're running their own business.
Right.
So there's that kind of connectivity. And then I think the amount of Latino culture, like last night I was at a party where there was all this salsa dancing, and it's like that every year, right? The Fair Trade Group holds a party, and it's just amazing to see how, human they make this industry. It's not transactional. It's about relationships.
Right. Yeah. That's
even at this size. I mean, when I met you, we would come to the show, and basically every attendee had somewhat similar experience. They experienced the same. They all went to the opening night reception. They all went to the keynote. We all had this in common experience. Well, those days are gone. Any 12 attendees can have 12 different experiences.
That's true.
Because it's so huge. And yet the relationships that we experienced when we were just 7,000 attendees or less is happening, but it's happening in the communities have just broken down. So there's communities everywhere here. The communities I don't even know about.
Right. And people are having their different experiences. Yeah, when we think about when Mark and you and I, when I was president of the SCAA of America, I think we thought it was a huge show at 3,000 in Boston, 2003, right?
Right.
And now, what are they hitting, 15, 17,000?
So, I don't know what the official numbers are this weekend, but it's up there in that 15 to 17.
And still, there's still a level of connectivity. But as Mike, you're saying, it's probably in these pods, right? Everybody's finding their tribe.
Right. Yeah, you could be a barista or a roaster or a producer, and they have their own circles. I think when we were all on the board, we were trying to make those circles come together. We always wanted to include everybody, and now it's gotten so large that's impossible to integrate all these circles together.
But I'm still committed to that idea, because I think that you need stakeholders from different sectors to be at the table talking together. And as you know, I started way back in 2003 an event called Let's Talk Coffee, which was with that exact focus, that not only did you want to have every grower know their buyer, and you'd put them at the table with the importer. That's what we were at Sustainable Harvest.
Right.
But then you started to realize, let's bring other stakeholders. And what I mean by that is, let's bring the banks that's financing the growers. Let's bring the nonprofit that's working in that same community. Let's bring the regional government. And we would all come together. And what I found in that business model, which I called the relationship coffee model, was that you would get... Problems are still hard to solve no matter what. And we sometimes don't like what the answer is. But if you have more voices at the table, I always felt you'd get the optimal solution, because sometimes people would bring other assets to the table that you didn't know exist. Like you might say, well, we can't afford as a roaster to pay for this water project. But then if you had an NGO there, they might say, that's exactly what we need, but we need your roaster brand to talk about it on the package.
Right.
So I'm still committed to how do we bring these tribes together, and maybe you do it through through projects or through supply chains that are separate, but you just sort of make sure that you have people talking. It's not a transactional, it's a relational business model.
And what do you think about right now at this point in time with the new administration in Washington and the future of like projects and NGOs and funding? Are we hitting a trough where this is going to be a really rough era, or do you see hope in that?
Well, I think both, right? I think that there's no question that if you were getting funded by USAID and now they're not here, we hear a lot of stories about projects. Coffee was really supported by the USAID projects, so that's a huge change for everybody who had those lives going, and now they have to readapt. And but there's a dismantling of the old system that's happening across our country in so many ways. I mean, obviously we know America's role in the world is getting questioned now, and all that stuff. So what I think is, what we need to do is, I don't think the world likes bullying.
No, clearly.
And I think that what happens here at this coffee show is that you learn how to work together and be collaborative. And I think that's what will come out of this. And people will find new sources. Some will fade away because they don't find new sources of funding and ways to sustain themselves. But those who do will thrive, because I think this industry is looking for a collaborative, productive path forward. And the problems are as hard as they've ever been in the history of coffee right now, with pricing and volatility. But you still know that there are solutions as we work together. And I think the more there are relationships of people, you can solve some things that maybe the bigger forces, like just the markets or the C market or the paper investors, sort of, we think, oh, how are we going to handle that? But sometimes just sitting down at the table together, like when I sit at this booth here that Kavoya has, there's not really a booth, it's a bunch of couches, and everybody's sitting and discussing things. And I think that's the way out. That's the path forward. So I'm pretty optimistic, but also I have to turn the news off, right? I can't deal with what I read. And, let me say, I mean, USAID did a lot of good work, but there was also a lot of things that we would go, like, that's not the fastest, most efficient way to really help these farms, right? There's a lot of overhead. I remember somebody once, well, anyway, we know that there was just naturally overhead involved as there is in any project. And I think that we'll probably get more agile about, like, how do we make sure the direct benefits are happening, right? If you have less money, you might get more focused. But that's my hope, too, is that we develop better models. So maybe good can come from it. I think it's very painful and very cruel, if you read the headlines. That's the hardest part. And I think when I come here, I haven't thought about the news for 3 days, and it's been delightful.
Yes. Anything, what's next after you leave the show? What are you doing? What's Dave's next month look like?
I do plan to go to. I want to talk about this carbon market for coffee, and I'm hoping to be in Europe, a World of Coffee.
Oh, okay.
In Geneva. I'm on the board of Cup of Excellence.
You are?
Do you know about Cup of Excellence?
Yes, I've heard of it.
Have you guys talked about it on your podcast?
I'm actually drinking Cup of Excellence coffee right now.
Is that right? It might be expensive, right?
It's free right across the aisle. The Guatemala
I don't believe we have talked much about.
Why don't you talk a little bit about it?
Well, Cup of Excellence is you're the board member, but I'll tell you my thoughts on Cup of Excellence. I've been on juries of COE before, so it's an international competition for coffee, a cupping competition that leads to an auction of the finest coffees of that country of that given year. They have a national competition that leads to the international, once the international judges come in. And you whittle it down to, I don't know, is it a top 25 now? Or whatever like goes to the auction platform. I guess if I have some recommendations for you, Dave, I always like to give a recommendation, put my nose in where it doesn't belong.
I like it.
Is that I've always struggled with the idea of COE that very few producers repeat their performance. And in many ways, I was quoted in the book God in a Cup.
A must read.
I don't know if it's a must read. She was a New York Times writer, wrote this book, and it was about the rise of like Jeff Watson and Peter Giuliano and Doug Zell and this whole, this movement of these people that were like celebrities and how they were managing. And it was really centered around the COE and the buying of these coffees. And I was quoted saying it was a homeless woman's beauty pageant. That's how I viewed it. And what I meant by that was you were having people that weren't going through their My Fair Lady moment to learn how to be in this world. And therefore, it was a complete lottery if you won. And the sad thing is the farmer would win, they would get this crazy high price, and then next year they were virtually ignored if they didn't place again. And I always struggled with the idea that we weren't training them to repeat the performance. And I believe that there's a missing opportunity within the COE platform to train the top 10, the top 15 to learn what they did right that year, what they should continue to do on their farms, be it processing, be it variety selection, be it when to harvest, and to learn from that success rather than just feel like it was a one-off and that's it. Those that do tend to repeat their performance in COE are extremely well-funded, very sophisticated, well-educated producers, and that's the exception. Those aren't the average farmers.
I think you make a really good point, and I think Cup of Excellence has a vision of making sure that more transparency about how people reach winning coffees and how they repeat them is absolutely essential.
Right.
I think back in the day, when people were entering Cup of Excellence, it was really by nature, right? It was the natural greatness of a coffee was really what was winning. And so sometimes those things could change. And we didn't have a lot of post-harvest processing science in coffee back in the day. Now you have CQI that's really going to sort of drop the Q. That may be something you guys will talk about in a podcast. They're moving the Q over to the specialty coffee value assessment. So they're sort of uniting the cupping side and adding more components to it, and that'll be a later podcast, I'm sure. But what I sort of see with the CQI is that they're going to focus more on post-harvest processing and get more of those techniques out there. And I hope Cup of Excellence can play a role in that, because when one of the things, Cup of Excellence is like the Olympics of coffee. It's the people that are running, sub 4-minute miles, sub 10-second 100-meter dashes in coffee. And that attracts global attention, especially consumers. And as you know, these coffees sometimes get thousands of dollars a pound. Yeah. Right? It's amazing. And that is a great way to capture people's attention. But what you're saying, and I totally agree, is that we now need to have, how do you create those in a way that's more available to people, and especially the smaller farmers. Sure. And the less funded.
Yeah, who need the help the most.
Yeah. But I think hopefully that's another example of like, where do you bring all these institutions that are working on things, CQI and Cup of Excellence? Can they integrate more? What one, like the coffee that Mike's drinking, like how was it processed, and how would you go to a website if you were a farmer and say, oh, I want to repeat that, and that you'd have that training there.
And how is that coffee, Mike?
It's great.
Do you know what it is?
I don't. I was in a hurry.
Okay.
He just heard Cup of Excellence. He's like, okay, I know.
This looks good.
It says it, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm excited to be on that board. That'll be something that I do. I hope that I can go visit, more coffee farms. My son's working on a coffee cherry, sort of like a syrup that's made from cascara.
Oh, excellent.
And I like that. He traveled with me from about 6 years old to coffee countries, and he knows a lot of the sons and daughters of the co-op leaders, and he knows
who are now coming into their own power.
Right, trying to figure out how to stay on the farm. And I think people at Origin are going to have to do innovative things like value-added processing and
absolutely
putting their cafes. And I just love watching him. He comes here and he feels like he's got all kinds of family members that he sees. Yeah. Although people, what happens when somebody comes in, they're 6 years old, and then they come back and they are 24, people think, oh my gosh, I'm aging, right? Because he's changed a lot.
Yeah, we're all feeling old looking at Gavin.
I actually got lightheaded.
Mike literally, there's no joke, he had to sit down on the edge of the couch.
Yeah, it does tell us that time is passing.
Right.
But Mike, you knew him when he was,
I knew him before he was.
Yeah. Which is what I love about coming back, seeing you guys. I mean, we're so lucky to be in an industry where people stick around and people never leave coffee. Why do you think that is?
Well, I have always told people about coffee that it's the one industry that there's endless opportunity. And if you say you're bored in coffee, you're not looking around. You could be an academic and be in coffee. You could be, a sensory nerd and be in coffee. You could be a marketer, an entrepreneur. You could be, a machine, equipment person. There's something, literally, a writer, a historian. There's something for everyone here, and I think that most young people that when they think about coffee or they hear about the industry, they think baristas and all of that. But when they're exposed to this greater world, it is its own universe here. And where else would you go? If you want to be in tech here. Why would you go develop games, develop a coffee thing? So I've never found a reason to leave. And it's not like I've switched fields in coffee that much. I've stayed in a very tight circle. But if I did want to go out there, I could find that opportunity out there.
Well, and I think about your career. You've been a roaster.
Yep.
You also grew products. You had your tea, you had your farm. You didn't you help start the barista competition? The world?
Yes, I was. I was on the original meeting. Although I'm not going to say I was part of it to create the Barista Guild. It was in a dinner at a house. Dismiss Smith and Trish and Andy Newbaum, they formed this, and I was at that dinner. Was the chair of the WBC and
That's
WCE,
the World Barista Council or
World Barista Championship, World Coffee Events. I was the first person to bring it to an origin country. I was Bogota in 2011 to have it at a producing country.
And a producer won that year, right? A producing country won the world championship. That was a big deal.
So I don't take credit like I did that, but I was a part of that movement. And the SCA presidency, I was on your environment committee, which became the sustainability committee. Dave tolerated me in there long enough.
Yeah.
I used to bug Mike in the office when he was running the show at at SCA. So
it's been and then you also now working on the green importing side. You've done it with several companies, big and medium.
Yeah, like when you think about when you owned your import company, what were some of your top employees that you had there? Any names come to mind?
Well, there's a lot of good people who I'm going to talk about. Well, there's Jorge Cuevas.
Wait, we were talking about me.
Mark Inman at the very top of the list, number one in the NFL draft. Mark Inman.
No, Jorge. I'm more like Deion Sanders' kid. I'm down there.
You're in the sixth round now. Poor guy.
No. Jorge was, obviously was.
Some names that people may know. Yeah. Stephen Vick.
Yep.
Went to work for us in Africa. He was with Blue Bottle and Intelli and Stumptown. We had Sarah Maroki. She's doing amazing things with training people with her coffee training system. The buyers for Stumptown, Shauna, and let's see.
You got Monica.
Monica's at Intelligentsia.
Yamara at CQI. I mean, a lot of people like to credit Doug Zell as being the George Steinbrenner of coffee. I think you might be the George Steinbrenner of coffee.
Well, I want to be nicer than George Steinbrenner and less mercurial, but I would say that Rick Reinhardt once said that I was the AAA ball club of specialty coffee, because people would,
or the Oakland A's,
right.
You would just feed other teams great players.
Well, and what would happen often is that people who weren't in coffee at all would come and see me. Aleko Chigonis is married to Allie, who came and did one of our Let's Talk Coffee. I mean, there's a lot of amazing people that just were not involved in coffee, and they would come, and I would just try to find them a role. And then you would just see, as long as they had a personality where they maybe were willing to kind of be authentic, whether it was a CEO they were talking to or a farmer leader, and they were able to generate conversations that built great relationships. And many of them spoke a second language, Spanish, and maybe they traveled on their own, so they had a certain resilience. We could teach them how to become Q graders or price risk management. And I think that's why we built kind of a team that was different than how typical traders at the time were, because they were really about building relationships where every grower knew their buyer.
Ted Legal used to always tell me, hire people with compassion, we can teach them coffee.
I think it's brilliant. Yeah.
Absolutely true.
Empathy, compassion, that's what this industry is about.
Wonderful. Well, Dave, thank you for joining us here at the show. We wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Another Cup, part of the Exchange Coffee Podcasting Network, presented by Kavoya Specialty Coffee and produced by me, Mike Ferguson. Our theme music for this episode is The Next Chapter by Albert Paul. You can email me with questions, thoughts, or ideas at mike.ferguson@kavoya.com. And if you enjoy anything you hear on the Exchange Coffee Podcasting Network, please leave a review and tell a friend or two. And as always, thanks for listening.
Reporting live from the Specialty Coffee Association Expo in Houston, Texas.
Please stop calling it a broadcast.
I'm Mark Inman.